The man on the buckboard is a silhouette against the brassy glare of the afternoon sun, a study in dust and angles. He holds the reins loosely, his gaze fixed on the road that unspools from the horizon toward the small, hopeful cluster of buildings that constitutes Prairie Ridge. He is waiting for a woman named Elspeth Finch, for a new beginning that smells of soap and baking bread instead of loneliness and wood smoke, for the simple, uncomplicated partnership promised in a letter written in a neat, careful hand. The stagecoach arrives in a boil of dust and a jangle of tired harness. He watches, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. The door creaches open. A small, booted foot appears, then another, then a third. 3 women, not one, descend onto the dusty street. They are identical. 3 cascades of sun-bleached blonde hair pinned in identical, severe buns. 3 faces, pale and heart-shaped, bearing the same expression of weary determination. 3 sets of blue eyes, wide and searching, that land on him in unison. The station master heaves a trunk to the ground, then another and another. Silas Blackwood feels the world tilt on its axis. One of them, the one in the middle, steps forward. Her chin is high, though a tremor runs through her hands, which are clasped tightly at her waist. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asks, her voice clear but thin, like glass stretched fine. He can only nod, his throat suddenly tight with a knot of confusion and a feeling he can't name, something dangerously close to dread. She takes a shallow breath, flanked by her mirror images. "I am Elspeth Finch. These are my sisters, Annalise and Beatrice." She pauses, letting the impossible statement settle in the hot, still air between them. Then she delivers the final, devastating blow. "We were told you were a man in need of a wife. Now we're all yours." Well, that's one way to meet. Before these 2, or rather, these 4, figure each other out. Tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. The silence that followed was vast and profound, broken only by the snort of a horse and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Silas stared, his mind a complete blank. He had prepared for one woman, one set of luggage, one extra plate at his rough-hewn table. His cabin, a sturdy but modest structure he'd built with his own 2 hands, had one spare room, a small, closet-like space he'd cleared out for his bride. The math simply did not work. 3 women, 3 trunks, 3 identical, expectant faces. It was a catastrophe wrapped in calico. Elspeth's words hung in the air, an absurdity he couldn't swat away. "Now we're all yours." The possessive pronoun was a brand on his skin. He felt the eyes of the station master on him, the curious peek of a woman from behind the curtains of the general store. A slow, hot flush crept up his neck. He had sent for a wife, not a spectacle. And with 3 words, "I'll take her," or rather, the unspoken, horrified question of which his life, and theirs, were irrevocably changed. He finally found his voice, a rough, gravelly thing and used to so much daytime conversation. "There's been a mistake." "No mistake, sir," Elspeth said, her voice unwavering though her sisters flanked her like nervous sparrows. "The correspondence was with me. The ticket was for me. But we could not be parted. We are a set, like china plates or silver spoons." Silas ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his stubble a familiar, grounding sensation in a world suddenly gone mad. He looked from one face to the next. They were identical, yet not. The one on the left, who he guessed was Annalise, had a softer, more watchful gaze. The one on the right, Beatrice, had a flicker of something brighter in her eyes, a hopefulness that seemed dangerously out of place. And Elspeth, the speaker, had the grim, resolute air of a general leading a desperate charge. He saw their worn-out boots, the frayed cuffs of their travel-dusted dresses. He saw the bone-deep weariness in the set of their shoulders. And beneath that, he saw a terror so profound it was almost a physical presence. They had burned every bridge to get here. There was no going back. "Get in the wagon," he grunted, turning his back on them to load the trunks. The wood groaned under the weight. 3 lives, packed into 3 boxes. He didn't know what he was doing. He only knew he couldn't leave them standing in the dust like unclaimed freight. The ride back to his ranch was a study in strained silence. Silas kept his eyes on the rumps of his horses, his mind churning. The triplets sat pressed together on the bench, a silent, unified entity. The prairie stretched out around them, immense and indifferent, a sea of brown grass under a bleached blue sky. To Silas, it was home. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, its sparse beauty. He wondered what they saw. An emptiness, a prison. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the winds by a low ridge of granite. The cabin was small, the barn sturdy, the corrals well-mended. It was a lonely place, a place built by solitude and sweat. As he pulled the wagon to a halt, he saw it all through their eyes. The starkness, the isolation, the crushing lack of another living soul for miles. This was the home he had offered one woman. Now it had to suffice for three. He led them inside. The main room was functional. A stone hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding his few provisions. A single door led to his bedroom, and another to the tiny room he'd prepared for his bride. He gestured vaguely. Food's in the pantry. Water's in the barrel. You can figure it out. He turned and walked out, needing air, needing space to think. He heard their hushed, urgent whispers behind him. He went to the barn, the familiar scent of hay and horse balm to his frayed nerves. What in God's name was he going to do? Sending them back was impossible. They had no money, no people. The agency in St. Louis would wash their hands of it. Keeping them was equally impossible. The logistics were a nightmare, but the social implications were a powder keg. A bachelor living with 3 young, unmarried women? The preacher, Reverend Miller, would have a fit. The whole county would be buzzing with gossip and condemnation. His reputation, already that of a reclusive and somewhat grim man, would be ruined. He stayed in the barn until dusk, mending a piece of tack that didn't need mending, his hands moving while his mind spun in circles. When he finally returned to the cabin, a soft lamplight spilled from the window, a sight so foreign it stopped him in his tracks. He pushed the door open. The room was transformed. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing the chill from the corners. The table was set with his 3 plates and his 1 spare. Something savory simmered in a pot over the flames, and the air was thick with the scent of onions and herbs. Annalise was at the hearth, stirring the pot with a quiet focus. Beatrice was carefully wiping down the shelves, her movements neat and efficient. Elspeth stood by the table, waiting. "We took the liberty, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone formal. "We hope you don't mind." He just stared. In a few hours, they had done more to make this cabin a home than he had in 5 years. "It's fine," he managed. He saw that they had placed their bedrolls in the small spare room, packed in like sardines. His own room remained untouched. He sat at the table, feeling like a stranger in his own house. They served him a stew, thick with potatoes and a rabbit he recognized as one that had been raiding his garden patch. It was the best thing he'd eaten in years. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one in the wagon. This was a fragile, watchful peace. After the meal, as Annalise and Beatrice cleared the plates, Elspeth spoke. "We need to be clear, Mr. Blackwood. We know this is not what you asked for. We are not asking you to honor the agreement with all of us. That would be improper." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "But we cannot be separated. We made a promise to our mother on her deathbed. Always together. Our father remarried, and his new wife, she did not want us. She paid the agency fee for one of us to be sent away. We pooled what little we had for the other fares. We hoped whoever you were, you would have a measure of kindness." Her confession laid their desperation bare. They were orphans, cast out and unwanted, with only each other to rely on. Silas looked at her, then at her sisters, who had stopped their work to listen, their faces etched with the same story of loss and hope. The hard knot of anger in his gut began to dissolve, replaced by a weary, unwelcome sense of responsibility. "I can't marry all of you," he said, stating the obvious. "I can't rightly marry any of you under these circumstances." "We understand," Elspeth said quickly, "but we are willing to work hard. We can cook, clean, mend, garden. Annalise is good with herbs and remedies. Beatrice has a way with animals. We will earn our keep, sir. Just let us stay together until we can figure out what to do." He looked around the warm, clean room. He thought of the years of silent, solitary meals, of clothes mended with clumsy, bachelor stitches. He thought of the endless, back-breaking work that was never, ever done. He was tired. He was lonely. And against all reason, against every ounce of common sense he possessed, he heard himself say, "The bedroom is yours. I'll sleep by the fire. We'll try it." For a while. The look of relief that washed over their three identical faces was so profound it was almost painful to watch. It was the look of shipwrecked sailors finding a shore, any shore. He had no idea what he had just agreed to. He only knew he had just traded his simple, lonely life for a complication of epic proportions. The next morning, Silas had to go to town for supplies. 3 extra people meant 3 times the flour, sugar, and coffee. As he hitched the team, Beatrice approached him, her hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Blackwood? I noticed the milk cow, Bessie. Her left hind quarter is a little swollen. If you'll allow me, I can make a poultice. My mother taught me." He grunted an affirmative, surprised. He'd noticed Bessie favoring the leg, but hadn't had time to look at it closely. When he returned that afternoon, the wagon laden with provisions, he found Beatrice in the barn, crooning softly to the cow as she tied a clean cloth filled with mashed herbs around the swollen joint. The animal, normally skittish, was placid under her touch. In town, he'd endured the predictable curiosity. Jed Abernathy, the proprietor of the general store, had watched him load the unusually large order of supplies, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Expecting company, Silas?" he'd asked, a sly grin playing on his lips. "Something like that," Silas had muttered, not offering any explanation. He felt the weight of the town's gaze as he drove away, the first whispers of gossip already taking root in his wake. It was a small town, and a secret was a commodity more valuable than gold. His arrival with 3 identical women was a secret that wouldn't last the day. The days settled into a strange new rhythm. Silas would rise before dawn, as always, but now the scent of coffee would already be in the air. He'd come in from his morning chores to find the table set and a hot breakfast waiting. Annalise was the quiet heart of the cabin, a silent, graceful presence who cooked and cleaned with an almost reverent concentration. Beatrice spent most of her time in the barn, tending to the animals with a gentle confidence that was astonishing. The chickens laid more eggs, Bessie's milk was richer, and even his perpetually grumpy gelding, Vulcan, seemed to tolerate her presence. Elspeth was the organizer, the planner. She took stock of their dwindling supplies, mended his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and managed the household with a firm but fair hand. They worked relentlessly, as if trying to justify their existence with every scrubbed floor and weeded row in the garden. They spoke little to him, and mostly amongst themselves in low, murmuring tones. But their presence filled the vast, aching silence of his life. He found himself listening for the sound of their soft laughter from the garden, or the harmony of their voices as they sang a quiet hymn while washing the dishes. He started to see the differences between them, small tells that gave them away. Annalise had a habit of tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. Beatrice's smile was quicker, reaching her eyes almost instantly. Elspeth's gaze was direct and steady, always assessing, always weighing. He learned to tell them apart not just by these subtle cues, but by the very air around them. Annalise was calm, Beatrice was warmth, and Elspeth was strength. One evening, a late spring storm blew in, a furious assault of wind and rain. A crack of lightning lit the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Silas saw Beatrice flinch, her face pale. A moment later, a panicked squawking erupted from the chicken coop. Before he could move, Beatrice was on her feet and out the door, disappearing into the deluge. "Beatrice," Elspeth cried, starting after her. "Stay here," Silas commanded, grabbing his oilskin coat. "I'll get her." He found her in the coop, struggling to latch a section of the roof that the wind had torn loose. She was soaked to the bone, her dress plastered to her thin frame, her hair a tangled, wet mess. She was trying to hold the wooden panel in place while the wind fought to rip it from her grasp. He moved behind her, his larger frame shielding her from the worst of the rain. "I've got it," he yelled over the storm. He held the panel steady while she fumbled with the latch, her fingers numb with cold. Finally, it caught. The chickens, safe and dry, settled into a disgruntled silence. He put a hand on her arm to guide her back to the cabin. She was trembling, whether from cold or fear, He couldn't tell. Inside, Elspeth and Annalise rushed to her, wrapping her in a dry blanket and sitting her by the fire. Elspeth turned to Silas, her eyes dark with worry and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Call me Silas," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He had insisted on formality, a way to keep a necessary distance. But in that moment, seeing the fierce, protective love between the sisters, that distance felt foolish. He was no longer just their reluctant landlord. He was their protector. The incident shifted something between them. The formality eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative familiarity. They started calling him Silas. Annalise would leave him a cup of coffee on the porch railing in the morning. Beatrice would tell him about the antics of the barn cats. And Elspeth would sometimes meet his gaze across the dinner table, a silent question in her eyes. A question he wasn't ready to answer. His feelings were becoming a tangled mess. He had sent for a wife, and in Elspeth, he saw everything he had hoped for. She was strong, intelligent, and capable. A woman who could stand as his partner against the harshness of this land. But she came with two shadows, two extensions of herself that he was becoming equally, if differently, fond of. He admired Annalise's quiet grace and Beatrice's gentle heart. To care for one was to care for all three. The thought of ever sending Annalise and Beatrice away was now unthinkable. They were as much a part of this place as the foundation stones of the cabin. This growing attachment made the whispers from town all the more threatening. When he rode in for mail, the silence that fell as he entered the general store was heavier than ever. Jed Abernathy served him with a smirk. "Hear you're running a regular boarding house up there, Silas." For a very particular kind of boarder. A few of the men lounging by the Cracker Barrel snickered. Silas felt the familiar burn of anger, but he clamped down on it. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He gathered his things, his jaw tight. "What I do on my land is my business, Jed." "Is that so?" A new voice cut in. Reverend Miller stood in the doorway, his face a mask of pious disapproval. "The good Lord's business is everyone's business, Mr. Blackwood. And a man living in sin with 3 young women is a stain on the moral fabric of this community." The direct confrontation struck him like a physical blow. The store went silent. "They are not living in sin," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "They are working for their keep. They are under my protection." "Protection?" the Reverend scoffed. "Or are they your prisoners? Your collection? It is an unnatural arrangement, Blackwood, an affront to decency. You will choose one to marry, as is proper, and send the other 2 away. Or you will face the judgment of this community. And of God." The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Silas stared at the preacher, at the smug face of Jed Abernathy, at the curious, condemning eyes of the other men. He saw the wall of their judgment closing in around him, around the fragile sanctuary he had built. He knew this was just the beginning. The town, having sensed a scandal, would not rest until it had torn his strange little family apart. He turned and walked out, the preacher's final words following him into the street. "Consider yourself warned, Mr. Blackwood." He rode home with a cold dread settling in his stomach. The peace was over. A storm was coming, far worse than any prairie squall. The ride back to the ranch was long, the miles stretching out under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, each one a hammer blow against the fragile structure of their lives. Choose one. Send the others away. It was the one thing he could not do, the one thing they could not bear. He had seen the terror in their eyes on that first day, the raw fear of being separated. They weren't just sisters. They were 3 parts of a whole, fused together by promises and shared pain. To sever that bond would be an act of cruelty he was not capable of. When he reached the cabin, the sight of smoke curling from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the twilight, only tightened the knot in his chest. This place was their home now. How could he tell them it was under threat? They knew something was wrong the moment he walked in. The 3 of them were at the table, mending a shirt by the light of a lantern, and they all looked up at once, their hands stilling. His face must have been a thundercloud. "Silas?" Elspeth asked, her voice laced with concern. He didn't soften the blow. He told them everything. About Abernathy's sneers, about the Reverend's ultimatum. He watched as the color drained from their faces, as the same shared fear from the day they arrived returned to their eyes. Beatrice's hands flew to her mouth, and Annalise reached for her sister's arm, a silent gesture of comfort. Only Elspeth held his gaze, her expression hardening into one of fierce, desperate resolve. "He cannot do that," she whispered, though it sounded more like a prayer than a statement. "He cannot force you to send us away." "He can make our lives hell," Silas countered, his voice grim. "He can turn the whole town against us. They could stop selling me supplies. The sheriff could be convinced to come up here on some trumped-up charge of moral indecency." He paced the small room, the space suddenly feeling like a cage. "I knew this would happen. I was a fool to think it wouldn't." "You were kind," Annalise said softly, her first time speaking directly to him about such a serious matter. "You showed us mercy when no one else would." Her simple, heartfelt words cut through his anger, leaving him with the raw, aching truth of his dilemma. He had acted out of a moment of pity, a flicker of decency. But now, his feelings were far more complicated. The thought of this cabin without Annalise's quiet presence, without Beatrice's bright spirit, without Elspeth's steady strength, the thought of returning to the crushing silence was unbearable. He realized with a jolt that he wasn't just protecting them anymore. He was protecting himself. He was protecting his home. "We will not be separated," Elspeth declared, standing up. Her small frame seemed to radiate a strength that filled the room. She looked at her sisters, a silent communication passing between them, a reaffirmation of their pact. Then she looked back at Silas. "There must be a way. If the problem is that you are unmarried and we are unmarried, then the solution is a marriage." Silas stopped pacing. "I told you, I can't marry all three of you." "No," she said, her cheeks flushing pink in the lamplight. "You corresponded with me. The agreement was for me. Marry me, Silas." The proposal, so stark and practical, hung in the air between them. It was not a declaration of love, but a strategic move on a battlefield. A sacrifice. "If you marry me," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "then Annalise and Beatrice are my sisters. My family. They would be living in their sister's house, under the protection of their brother-in-law. It would be proper. Family." The Reverend could not argue with family. He stared at her, at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her plan. It was a loophole woven from honor and desperation. It would chain him to her, to all of them, in a way that was permanent and binding. A marriage of convenience, a shield against the world. But as he looked at Elspeth, standing so proud and defiant, offering herself up to save her sisters, he felt a surge of something far warmer than admiration. He saw not just a strategist, but a woman of incredible courage. "You would do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Tie yourself to me, a man you barely know, to protect them?" "They are my life," she answered simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And you are a good man, Silas Blackwood. You have been honorable. There are worse fates than being tied to an honorable man." He looked past her to Annalise and Beatrice. Their faces were a mixture of hope and sorrow. Hope for their salvation, and sorrow for the sacrifice their sister was willing to make. But he saw their consent in their eyes. This was their only move, their only chance. The decision settled in him, heavy and sure. It was a radical, desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. It was a way to fight back not with fists or guns, but with the laws of society itself. To use the very institution the preacher held so sacred against him. "All right," Silas said, the word feeling momentous, a stone dropping into a deep well. "All right, Elspeth, we'll do it. I'll ride to the county seat tomorrow and get the license. We'll face the preacher on Sunday." He had made his choice. He had chosen them. All of them. He was no longer just Silas Blackwood, the reclusive rancher. He was about to become a husband and a guardian, the head of a strange, tripartite family forged in desperation and bound by loyalty. He was choosing them over the town, over respectability, over the simple life he once thought he wanted. And as he looked at the three sisters, huddled together by the firelight, a united front against the darkness outside, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he had made the right choice. The next few days were fraught with a tense, purposeful energy. Silas rode the long journey to the county seat, his mind a whirlwind of doubts and resolutions. The clerk, a man with spectacles and a suspicious nature, had raised an eyebrow at the request for a marriage license between Silas Blackwood and Elspeth Finch, a name he didn't recognize. But the paperwork was in order, and Silas's silver dollars were good. He rode back with the document tucked safely in his coat, a piece of paper that felt as heavy as a deed to a new life. Back at the ranch, the sisters prepared for the coming confrontation as if for war. They scrubbed the cabin until the floorboards shone. They mended their best dresses, their needles flying with grim determination. There was little talk. The air was thick with unspoken fears and a shared, steely resolve. Silas found himself watching Elspeth, seeing her in a new light. She was not just as intended, a solution to a problem. She was a woman who looked at the world without flinching, a woman who would walk into a fire for the people she loved. The respect he felt for her was deepening into something more profound, something that made his heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar tenderness. Sunday arrived, bright and merciless. Silas hitched the wagon, his hands steady despite the tremor in his gut. The sisters emerged from the cabin, dressed in their identical, mended blue dresses, their hair neatly pinned. They looked like three prim choir girls, their faces pale but composed. They climbed into the wagon, and Elspeth sat beside him on the driver's bench. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the warmth of her shoulder pressed against his, a small point of contact in a hostile world. The drive to town was silent. As they approached, they could see the buggies and horses gathered around the small white church. It seemed the entire population of Prairie Ridge was there, drawn by the scent of scandal and the promise of a sermon that would surely feature Silas Blackwood as its central center. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the church steps. As he helped Elspeth down, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. All eyes were on them. Reverend Miller stood at the top of the steps, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon, his face a thunderous mask of righteousness. The sheriff, a weary-looking man named Calloway, stood beside him, his expression more troubled than condemning. Blackwood, the preacher boomed, his voice rolling over the silent crowd. I see you have defied my counsel. You have brought this spectacle into the Lord's house on the Sabbath. Sheriff, I demand you remove these two women from this man's custody. They are a corrupting influence, living in a state of impropriety. Sheriff Calloway shifted uncomfortably. Silas, the Reverend has filed a formal complaint. Folks are concerned. An arrangement like yours, it ain't natural. Silas didn't answer immediately. He waited until Annalise and Beatrice were standing beside Elspeth, the four of them a small, defiant island in a sea of hostile faces. Then he looked not at the preacher, but at the sheriff, and then at the faces in the crowd. People he had known for years, people who had traded with him, who had weathered the same storms and droughts. There is nothing improper at my ranch, Sheriff, Silas said, his voice clear and steady, carrying in the still air. These women are decent, hard-working, and God-fearing. More than I can say for some who are quick to cast stones. He let his gaze fall on Jed Abernathy, who had the grace to look away. Decency, the Reverend sputtered. You live under one roof, unmarried. It is an abomination. You're right, Reverend, Silas said, and a murmur went through the crowd at his apparent concession. It is not proper for a man to live with an unmarried woman, which is why I intend to rectify that. He reached into his coat and produced the marriage license, holding it up for all to see. This is a license for me to marry Miss Elspeth Finch. I believe you are empowered to perform the ceremony, Reverend. Right here, right now, the crowd gasped. The preacher stared at the paper as if it were a snake. This was not the confession and repentance he had expected. This was a masterstroke of strategy that turned his own rules against him. You cannot be serious, he stammered. As serious as a heart attack, Silas said grimly. We will be married, and Annalise and Beatrice will remain at the ranch, as is their right. They will live under the roof of their sister and her husband. They will be my family, my responsibility. Are you telling me, Reverend, that you would deny a woman the comfort of her own sisters? Would you cast family out into the wilderness? Where is your Christian charity in that? He had cornered him. The preacher looked from the license to the sheriff, to the expectant faces of his congregation. He had preached the sanctity of marriage, the importance of family. To refuse now would be to expose his crusade for what it was, a petty, personal vendetta fueled by gossip. Sheriff Calloway stepped forward, a look of weary relief on his face. He took the license from Silas and inspected it. It's legal, he announced to the crowd. He handed it to the preacher. Reverend, it seems you have a wedding to conduct. The preacher's face was purple with fury, but he was trapped. He snatched the paper, his jaw working silently. He had been outmaneuvered, his authority publicly dismantled by a quiet rancher and 3 determined girls. Silas turned to Elspeth. He took her hand. It was cold, but it didn't tremble. He looked into her eyes and saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of something deeper, a mirror of the fierce, protective emotion that was roaring through his own chest. In that moment, on the steps of a hostile church, surrounded by enemies, they were not just allies in a desperate plan. They were a union. "If you would please begin, Reverend," Silas said, his voice ringing with a victory that was quiet, absolute, and profoundly sweet. He stood tall, Elspeth's hand in his, her sisters standing faithfully behind her, and faced their future together. The ceremony was the shortest and most grudging in the history of Prairie Ridge. Reverend Miller rushed through the words, his voice clipped and sour, but the vows were spoken, the promises made. When he pronounced them man and wife, the silence from the crowd was deafening. There were no cheers, no well wishes. Silas didn't care. He looked at his wife, Elspeth, and saw the tension finally leave her shoulders. He was her husband. This was his family. The town could whisper all it wanted. They were safe. The ride home was as quiet as the ride to town had been, but the silence was entirely different. It was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with a profound, bone-deep relief. When they reached the ranch, the place looked different, more solid, more permanent. It was truly their home now. That evening, a quiet celebration took place. Annalise had prepared a special meal, and Beatrice had picked a small bouquet of wildflowers for the table. After they ate, Silas looked at his new sisters-in-law. "That small room is too crowded," he said. "Tomorrow, we start adding on to the cabin. A proper room for you both." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and even the stoic Annalise gave him a small, watery smile. Later, as the sisters prepared for bed, Silas found himself alone with Elspeth by the fire. The awkwardness of their new status hung between them. He was her husband. She was his wife. But they were still strangers in so many ways. "You were brave today," he said quietly. She looked at the flames, her face soft in the flickering light. "So were you. You stood for us when you could have just thrown us out." "I couldn't," he admitted, the truth of it raw and simple. "This place, it was just a piece of land and a house before you came." Now, he trailed off, unable to articulate the massive shift that had occurred inside him. She understood anyway. She reached out and, for the first time, touched his hand where it rested on the mantelpiece. Her touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a shock of warmth through him. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. He cleared his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gestured to his bedroom door. That's your room now, too." "Our room." He felt a flush creep up his neck. I can still sleep out here for a while, if you'd prefer. To give you time." Elspeth looked from his face to the open bedroom door, and then back again. A small, shy smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, erasing the last traces of weariness and fear. "No," she said softly. I think it's time we started acting like a family. All of us." She left her hand on his for a moment longer before turning and walking into their room, leaving the door open behind her. An invitation. A promise. He stood by the fire for a long time, the warmth of her touch lingering on his skin. He looked around the small, cluttered cabin, at the signs of life and care everywhere. He heard the soft murmur of her sisters' voices from their room, a sound of safety and contentment. He had sent a letter across the country, asking for a partner to share his lonely life. He had gotten so much more. He had gotten a family, forged in adversity and sealed with courage. He had gotten a wife whose strength matched the vast, unyielding prairie itself. He looked toward the open door, toward the new life that was waiting for him. And for the first time in a very long time, Silas Blackwood felt truly, completely home. I am a Western storyteller, sharing tales of grit, love, and the untamed frontier. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.